Hey guys, welcome to OCWG meeting number 9, Open Canvas Working Group, and we're working on building an interoperable infinite canvas standard. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen where we have a TL draw. We're taking notes. Before I do that, a couple shout outs slash thanks. Thanks to Orion, who's not here, for facilitating the last meeting that I was not able to attend. And Michael for stepping in to help with some of the organizational and facilitation stuff, including writing up the summary of meeting number 8, which you can find on GitHub. That was very helpful for me in prepping for this meeting, to be able to go get the summary from the previous meeting. Let me go ahead and share my screen and share the TL draw. In case you're watching this recording and you're curious about this, you can find some information about OCWG on our website at canvasprotocol.org, or you can go straight to github.com/OCWG to find the GitHub organization. And then that will have links to previous meetings and meeting discussions. So this link here will take you to the previous discussion, or sorry, this meeting summary for meeting number 8. And you can catch up on where things are there. And those discussions on GitHub also have links to the recordings, which are on YouTube, and the transcripts for previous meetings. What we're actively working on right now is the spec for OCWG. And so you can find that at OCWG/spec. And then we're trying to do most of our work, even though we have a Discord for chat like interactions between this group, we're trying to keep most of our things that we work on in public on GitHub discussions so that they're discoverable for people. They're also not kind of walled off behind Discord, and you can share a URL to them and all the goodness of the web. So if you have meaty stuff, feel free to discuss it in Discord, but anything that's meaty should eventually arrive in a GitHub discussion where it's like more accessible. Cool. So I love to give people who it's their first time in the meeting a quick chance to introduce themselves. Maybe just talk about what you're working on and what you are interested in, why you're interested in OCWG. I'm pretty sure, Aaron, I don't know if you were at the last meeting and would like to introduce yourself, but give you that opportunity. Everybody else I know has been at a meeting already.
Yeah, so I was at the last meeting, and I don't exactly remember who was at the previous meeting, but I heard you say that you weren't. So yeah, about me, I am somebody who's working on GLTF extensions with OMI Group, and the goal here is
Awesome.
to increase interoperability for 3D content. Because the current status quo is that you have to like reset up a lot of stuff every time you move it from one app to the other. To make an analogy with canvases, that would be like if you tried to bring from one Canvas app into another and you just had to like take each PNG file and move them over one by one. And that is very unfortunate. That kind of sucks. So the idea here is that we can come up with a format that's interoperable so that we can just have that one format for exchanging data. And I think that the Open Canvas Working Group is a really cool idea. I think that we do need some kind of format like GLTF, but for 2D content, because GLTF is absolutely 3D only. Um,
Mm.
and I might be interested in making a Godot implementation of OCWG, depending on, or whatever this format is called. I guess Open Canvas. Uh, Whenever it's like getting to a more mature state and we have a good idea of what's going to be in it. I have commented a little bit on it. And I also opened an issue about like the legal stuff because that's probably something that needs to be figured out pretty early on. But I look forward to this. Yeah.
Very cool. So glad you're joining, Aaron. And yeah, discovering the GLTF community through Jen was, yeah, absolutely. It was so confirming in many ways because there was ideas that we had arrived at that just gelled so well with the way that GLTF is both structured from an extension standpoint and run. And I feel like there's still a lot we can learn from that community in terms of things that y'all have already run into and kind of how we should prioritize our time and effort. So glad you're here. Very cool. Well, speaking of the legal and license stuff, maybe we can just start there in terms of the proposed agenda, um, and then we can dive into the other agenda items. I see there's one from Max, and then there's also just talking about where we're at with this with the draft schema. Um, Aaron, do you want to give us an overview of the issue that you created in GitHub and discuss it a little bit?
Yeah, so the issue text opens up with a bunch of questions, basically asking what is the legal umbrella which OCWG is under. I'm like, what license
Mm-hmm.
is it under? Do contributors need to sign a CLA or agree to an agreement? And these things are pretty important to figure out early on because
Mm-hmm.
everything that gets contributed is going to have to like be under this umbrella. And if all the legal stuff isn't figured out now, it could be difficult to figure out later. And if it's not ever figured out, then it could be difficult to get anybody to adopt this. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not just about like the license of like the work itself. It's also about like patents and stuff. You want to make sure that when you're building a standard, nobody is submitting something that's like under a patent. So
Mm-hmm.
like OMI operates under the W3C, and the W3C requires that you sign an agreement that basically says that if you contribute something to the W3C, it's not going to be patent infringing.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, so the very short answer to all of your questions is that Orion Reed and I had the idea for this several months ago and initiated it, and there is no legal structure whatsoever. And in terms of uh, open canvas or the group, um, not opposed to doing the work and to setting something up, but it was just not something that was high on our list of concerns. I think one thing we were trying to be very intentional about was being as open as possible with the community aspect of things. So that kind of led to some of the decisions around making things available open source on GitHub, making sure that all of our communications are public in terms of meetings are recorded, transcripts are public, and making sure that they're announced publicly. Everything in Discord, there's like a single admin channel that's private, where we'll do like logistics conversations that would be extremely boring to other people, but I have no problem with making that public even. So I think that's been one of the principles from the beginning has definitely been as be as open as possible. But I think I like the framing of what you're coming out with this legal piece of like, um, by doing the legal paperwork, we can ensure that it continues to remain open and viable. It's like it's a way of maybe formalizing some of that openness. So that's a great point. Um,
And I
I
do
am not a
applaud you. I
Yeah,
applaud you
sure.
for to committing to this openness because a lot of other groups, both open standards and open source, tend to operate with some level of closed doors.
Mm,
Chronos, MSF, Godot, Blender all do this.
hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, no, it feels good to work this way. I think my inspiration has been a group called Fission that works on a couple different specs. The UCAN spec. There's a Oh gosh, what's the other? There's a couple different specs that they've worked on, and I watched the way that they worked and said, "Hey, this works really well. I'll just borrow everything I can from them." Um, I don't have any special expertise in licensing, and I don't know if anyone that's on the call now is has a good sense of that, or maybe Aaron, this is something that we could learn from the GLTF community. Like, is there a pattern that we should follow that GLTF has already gone through here?
I am not a lawyer, so I can't speak to the exact specifics, but I would indeed start by researching what is it that the W3C does, what is it that the Cronus Group does, what is it that these other
Hmm.
organizations do, and that might be a good starting point at the very least. It's possible that like you could just straight up copy paste like the W3C agreement and like just change the wording to refer to OCWG and then like you'd be good.
Hmm.
I don't know
Okay.
exactly what changes would be required if any.
Okay. I know someone in my network that I can ask in case it, unless there is somebody on the call that has like special expertise and desire to like tackle this area. Um,
And also, Chronos is spelled with a H after the K.
Gotcha. I was just noting that's what took me a long time to type it. I was like, it's either CR or CHR or KR, but I did not guess KHR. Is Kronos the group that is that the group that surrounds GLTF?
Yeah, so there Kronos is one of the bigger standards organizations. So they make GLTF the core spec, and there's of course other groups like OMI that builds extensions on it. But Kronos also does things like they OpenGL, Vulkan,
Oh
OpenXR,
yeah,
like so they do a lot of things actually.
gotcha. I thought that name sounded familiar. I used to be a game developer literally 20 years ago, so yeah. I don't know if Kronos was around then, but OpenGL certainly was. Written a lot of that code, but a long time ago. Um, Interesting. Okay, cool. No,
Yeah, I have
I
a
appreciate
thought
you bring.
there.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Steve. Yeah.
I think we do have to be aware of when we're looking at the different standards that have this kind of uh, process, we should be aware of the industry and the climate of that industry. I participated in telecommunication standards before, and there, companies got great pleasure and assumed that everything they contributed was patented. When they got something in, they're like, "Yes, we got it in. Everyone has to pay us now." Um, but other industries might not be so have such a climate. So it does depend on the kind of industry that we're in,
Hmm.
on how needed this is.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think one of the um, yeah, if you look at a lot of the companies that are interested in OCWG right now, a lot of them are themselves either open source companies or SaaS companies that take advantage of open source. So, you know, you'd have Obsidian, um, obviously TL Draw, Excalidraw, you know, React Flow, and these different open source frameworks for canvases. And then you have the world of sort of SaaS products like Mira and um, Muse and that kind of stuff that are open. But all of those companies, those SaaS companies, generally leverage open source and expect it to have a non-commercial license, the ability to use it without having to pay an organization. So I think in terms of the industry that we're in, I think that the industry will be very favorable to a. I think the W3C is a great comp, actually, that we should look into, where it's expected that you're contributing to an like sort of a public good rather than something that you can guarantee patent revenues for your submissions to it. Um, but yeah, like I said, I have a friend who's very this is what he does is open source licensing, and so I can reach out to him and see what his thoughts are on this. Any other thoughts from anybody or like um, around this topic particularly?
Yeah, I had a question regarding the patents. How do we know if we use something that's patented?
We don't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So the
that's
basics,
true. Yeah.
the basic thing to do is so there are licenses for code, for data, and for documents. And our spec will be a document, and some of the examples might turn a bit more data-rich, but it's mostly a document. For documents, all this copyright stuff is the easiest. There are certainly just agreed upon licenses. Rule number one of licenses, choose a pre-existing license. Do not roll your own license. It makes it too hard for other people to find out what the license actually is. MIT license might work. The most important thing, if you want to give your work away for free, is to waive away any liability you can. Like just disclaim at your own risk. That's the most fundamental thing, and you can reuse it. And then there's some vanity clauses like, yeah, but if you use it, put our names somewhere. And the license that are just like, use it, do whatever you want. And if we are that open, then licensing should be almost trivial. And about the patents, there's no way we can foresee whether something we invented was invented ago and is now patented. And
Well,
that's just life.
at a minimum, I'm not exactly sure like the full extent, but at a minimum, we need to have something that asserts that if you are contributing to OCWG, then to your knowledge, you are not contributing something that's patented.
That's
Like
a good idea.
you don't need to scan the entire globe for patents just to prove to yourself that like it's not patented. As long as you're not intentionally submitting patented stuff.
Yeah, basically
But
you're
would
pushing the liability onto the contributor, is my understanding how that works. It's like the contributor is basically saying, I'm asserting that as far as I know, this is patent, that there's no patent violations. And so if someone does it my point is, if someone does it in malice, they would be the one who's responsible. The contributor would be someone who's responsible.
if you can ever prove that, but yeah, at least you can try.
Yeah, I think, in other words, they would be the one that you would have to try and prove it with, right? Is that they would be the legal. Well, we'll see. Like I said, I don't know that much about it. I should stop talking. But it's a great thing to bring up, Aaron, to kind of make sure that we're not running into unexpected roadblocks in the future that make it difficult for people to adopt. And yeah, in fact, I think we might already have an MIT license in the spec directory. For some reason I recall when I was sitting down to work on this with, nope. Okay, we just have the README. I think Orion and I very briefly discussed throwing a license in there and then decided not to, which is, I'm glad we didn't in retrospect. We can actually have a little bit more formal thought around that. But I think MIT was definitely the assumption, Max, when we were
Yeah,
thinking about it.
MIT is great. No, like I do not know of any problems with it. I put linked in the chat that OMI is using the W3C. It's is on the software and document license from the W3C because it's all under the W3C. But I don't
Mm-hmm.
know, like what are the advantages of that versus MIT? Like I think they're both very good. So just whatever.
Cool.
MIT is great.
Great. That's awesome. All right. Well, moving on to the next item. Max, do you want to talk about your set of things?
Yeah, I think we tend to mix some issues a little bit, and if we separate them, it makes it easier to think about them. So first of all, like at the high level, what is an open canvas representing? What is it? Before we think about how can we store it in JSON. So in my view, an open canvas in the simplest form is maybe like you have little boxes on the screen, rectangles, and they show something that's coming from somewhere. So we call these boxes items, and what they show, we call them resources. And that's a super simple mental image that might serve as a guiding metaphor. And then, of course, what are these rectangles showing? Well, some of them are showing images, some show scribbles, some show text, some show an arrow, whatever. Things you can see are in items. So we have items and resources. And resources are web resources, as we know them already. You do a REST request, get somewhere, some URL, you get back the resource or representation of it. Now, what we want to have is we want to store some resources in the JSON file, and some resources which are too large, we store them next to the JSON file on disk. And some JSON files, some resources that change too often or even too large for that, they remain at their URL. So resources have different places where they can be stored. And now we only have to find out, okay, how do we store resources in the JSON file? How do we store them next to the JSON file and somewhere have their metadata? How do we store items? And then we also have some structure between items. Should not forget that. But we have some very few conceptual things that we actually want to store. And then it's always about, okay, how do we store properties about items? And now we are in the field of extensible JSON. How can we have several tools dealing about the same item without deleting data from each other? And I looked around a little bit and wrote up a proposal for JSON namespaces, posted on Hacker News, only to get back, yeah, that exists already. That's called JSON linked data. And then I looked closer into JSON linked data, and it's kind of true. maybe we just want a subset of JSON link data, because JSON link data really offers, I think, what we need, but more than we need. So it's, I have to look into it more, but I think we can use a non-confusing subset that makes
Gotcha.
valid
So,
data without messing up our syntax.
gotcha.
I can very quickly, in a few sentences, like go over how GLTF does references to these external resources files. So how
Yeah,
it works is that if in places where an external file is needed, there's a URI property. And this URI property can be set to any kind of like URI, but generally it's referring to a file on the file system, and that file path is relative to the file. So you can set up the folder structure wherever you want. You can do like a subfolder for all the assets, or you can just dump everything next to it, or and really anywhere else that you want. But you just have to specify where it is in the URI, and then the way that you like give it context for like what that is just dependent on the context and where the URI is used. So for example, GLTF has an images array, and each image is like a sub-JSON with a URI property and maybe a few other properties.
So when you're
and
saying GLTF has an images array, you mean that a GLTF node can refer to a set of images?
Let me just write it out here so
Yeah,
that
yeah. This
we're
is
all on the
great.
same page.
Love it. And is images a top level thing in GLTF?
Yes. So I didn't
Okay,
include the absolute top document braces, but you could just
that's
pretend
fine.
that they're there.
Yep.
and how does the reader know whether you're reading an image PNG or image JPEG, or what kind of
Yeah,
resource you have,
content
the
type.
content type?
Yeah, so what you do is you would have the URI here,
Uh-huh.
and it can be inferred, but then you can also in some cases have a MIME type property, image slash PNG, just like that.
Hmm.
And the MIME type is actually required in some other contexts. For example, if you want to store just like a buffer of data, just like or store something without like a file extension. Um, that way, like it can understand what that data is.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think the difference with we would basically be saying, I think the way that we've discussed it so far, and Max, I'm interested in your clarification here, is that we would have a nodes array and a node, and that's basically what you've been calling items in your description
Okay.
just now. Items and nodes are the same thing. And then each item or node can reference a single resource, and that resource would then have a URI and a MIME type. Is more or less what I was hearing you
Yeah.
say. Cool.
And for the local files, do you use a file protocol or
Mhm.
just a naked file path?
I think, oh, I see. Would you use this? I think what he's asking is this.
Is it file colon and then the local relative URL URI, or is it just the
So
relative URI?
it's
Interesting.
not it actually is like if you don't have anything, it's
It's
like
implicit.
assumed to be a file that's
Okay.
relative to the current file, but you could also do like HTTP whatever if you want it to be
Mm-hmm.
used remote.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay. So conceptually, all
Oops, sorry.
resources have a location, a URI, and a content type, but in some contexts, you can deduce that this
This,
must be a local file, so this is a file scheme, or it has this extension and it was never given a content type, so it's probably, if it's .txt, this will be a text plain. So there are some like MIME type mappings, some magic to shorten stuff. We also want that because if we have like a normal text label in the main
mhm.
file, we don't want to have to say, this is actually content type text plain, I'm saying, and the content is actually hello.
Right.
So
Right.
there we don't even want to have a URI. We just want to include the resource inline in its completeness. So
Mm-hmm.
that content hello is enough. And from
It's
that
interesting that they made the choice to decouple the resources from the images. The implication being that like multiple nodes can point to the same image.
Yeah, we should do the
Yeah.
same.
And actually, what I wrote here, by the way, is a simplification. Because in GLTF, a node can't refer to an image. A node might refer to a mesh, which has a material, which has a texture, which has an image. And in GLTF,
Gotcha.
it's like there's a
Understood.
lot of layers like this, and a lot of those layers may be just unnecessary for Open Canvas. But like the
Mm-hmm.
base layer here of just having an image that refers to this, I feel like that's meaningful. Especially if you want to embed that image within the document. Like if you have instead of URI, you might have just like a stream of bytes here, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
that way you want to be able to refer to it within the file without duplicating those actual bytes.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm thinking about it from the user's perspective. I just can't think of, obviously I could imagine features in a fictitious infinite canvas, but I'm having trouble imagining or thinking of a use case with an existing infinite canvas where the same resource exists in multiple places, effectively is transcluded or whatever. It like the same resource is being used as the resource for multiple items. Um,
This is
Yeah, why
common in
not?
GLTF. I don't know about a Canvas, but I would be surprised if you wouldn't want to allow that as a thing to do.
Yeah,
I know
even
if you
like
duplicate an image, 1,000 times
of
mhm.
course, like
in
in a
in
moderation
one
board where
place.
you have a sticky note image and you use it over and over again, that's quite common.
Oh, okay. Okay. I see what you're saying, Max and Steve. Like if you're I got it. I was thinking more of yeah, so system level things, like an example, like the sticky note image is a great example, or yeah, a star. Um and obviously this is better represented as SVG or whatever, but like yeah, here's the sticky note image in DL draw. And so yeah, this obviously they're probably that's probably not an external resource. That's actually a CSS thing. But I see what you're saying of like a stamp basically would probably be a better example, a stamp that you'd want to reuse in multiple places. And um, yeah, okay, I'm with you. The thing I don't like about it is the one of the goals that we talked about early on was making um, a, a open canvas as human readable as possible. Not that humans would be reading it. This is mostly machine readable, but it should be comprehensible, and it's which is why we chose JSON over say XML and some other things. And so decoupling the resource um, from the node means that you have two places to look. You'll have one, but
Well, we have two worlds. We have like the data format on disk, and then we
mhm.
load it, and then we have the conceptual world. Conceptually, we have nodes showing resources. But in our syntax, if a resource is only used in one node, we could have an abbreviated form where you can just inline it. Same
Mm-hmm.
semantics. Why not?
Yeah, I would definitely appreciate that option for inlining if you're not going to reuse it. And then you could potentially have an empty resources array or images array if all the objects are only used once. Like if you look at this canvas right now, there's no repetition on this canvas that I'm aware of. If anybody can see it, like point it out to me. But all of the items in this canvas right now are have
Except
their resources embedded.
the arrows.
Arrows
I see
are
what Jess's
yeah.
point is basically that single-use images are common enough where you're thinking that you want to include a special thing for that in Open Canvas just for embedding that image directly there in case you don't want it to be shared. That makes sense.
Yeah. And text is a resource type. So another thing to note about arrows is like we'll have multiple ways of implementing them, but in the current thinking on arrows is that they won't be implemented with an image element. They won't have a resource effectively. They'll be implemented purely theoretically, which leaves it up to the renderer to decide how to represent the arrow. Now here's another, like the wrinkle there would be, what about this thing? And the answer is, this is not an arrow, this is a shape, right? It happens to be shaped like an arrow, but it does not have the ability to connect two items. So the other piece, and we can look at the spec to talk more about this, but the other thing about arrows is that they imply a relation between nodes. Is not imply, they specify optionally specify a relationship between nodes that will encode separately. So the other piece that we have going on that, as far as I know, GLTF does not, is that in addition to items and resources, there's also a relations or array that is purely conceptual and will not be visualized unless a renderer chooses to visualize those relationships between the items. So that goes back to like popping all the way back to where Max started, which is, what does a canvas represent? A canvas represents items where each item displays a resource. Go ahead.
Should we know once and for all clarify item or node and just stick to one? Because I think I confused it. You started with node and now I brought in items. Let's just fix it to one term.
I like nodes. And that's where, and everything else that we've been saying in all past meetings and in the spec says nodes. So are we cool with calling them nodes?
Then let's keep it nodes.
If there's ever a move to replace nodes with items, we'll just need to do some Command F across, or Command Shift F, or whatever the find all across all the project is, and like make that change. But right now it's nodes.
The precedent across the game industry is that if it's a thing in the scene tree that has a transform, is called a node.
Oh, good. Okay, good. Then we're in good company, because there will be a potential transform with the nodes as well. So yeah, it is a thing in the scene tree is another way of saying what nodes are. And nodes optionally have a resource. And as we were just discussing, resources can be inline and embedded in the file. Well, they can be specified inline, or they can be specified in this separate, we might call them resources. Like the question is, what's the analog here? And I think it's maybe resource. I do like that. I like that ode to the web. Max is giving a thumbs up. And so we have like this resources. You can have it referenced in a resources array and stored separately, or you can inline the resource underneath the node. And then the resource is either embedded in the file, is a next to the file, or remote in the URL. And I do think this is a sensible way of doing it. Like we were just talking about the URI. If whether we have a file / parameter for files, or whether we infer it when there is no protocol at the beginning, I'm ambivalent on that. And then yeah, Max was noting that MIME types should be implied based on extensions for the URI. They can be implied.
Yeah, just as a convenience. Conceptually, every resource has content and a MIME type, but depending on how we put the syntax, we could infer it.
Yeah.
The way it works in GLTF is that if there's a MIME type, the type is the MIME type, else it's inferred from the file extension. And if there's neither a file extension nor a MIME type, it's invalid.
Very cool. What if it's an unknown extension type? Is that the same as it's also invalid?
If it's unknown, then it can't be read anyway. Like maybe if there's like a WebP, like, and your app can't load WebP, then like, you just can't load it. So only known extensions are going to be loadable.
Well, you can also auto-discover file types based on the first magic bytes in the file.
If you're relying on the magic bytes, then the GLTF side would say that you have to include MIME type as an explicit property.
That's for HTTP too. Because HTTP, you always get the MIME type.
Yeah, HTTP returns a MIME type to the client.
Oh, that's part of the request. I mean, the response.
Yeah, that's the content negotiation.
And they could potentially differ. Yep.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I'm in the response. Yeah. Okay. And so the way that we've been talking about nodes versus relations is that nodes are the visible elements on the canvas, and relations are the abstract relationships between nodes that are not necessarily visible. It doesn't mean that they're never visible. The renderer basically gets to decide whether to visualize them or not, and may or may not create them based on things like arrows, which brings us back to that conversation about arrows. So in TLDraw specifically, these two items, these two nodes, this text node and this image node, in TLDraw's export format, not in Open Canvas because they don't export Open Canvas yet, there is a relation between these two objects that's specified by this arrow. So the conceptual thing is captured in TLDraw, is my point. It's not captured in all canvases. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's Excalidraw that doesn't capture it as a separate thing. But there are certainly canvases out there that just represent this arrow and its location and kind of like where, like its bounds, but do not specify a relationship between the two nodes that it happens to like be close to or kind of point to.
Well, in this case, in order to bring these two ways how to represent arrows, are they like a relation or are they like a node?
Thank you for asking. Yeah,
we need to say, well, this node is actually showing this relation.
Yep. And so what we've said so far about this is that two things. One, this is why we want to enable extensibility, so that nodes that have a relation associated with them, like TLDraw arrows, would be part of you could use a TLDraw specific extension for defining a TLDraw arrow that assumes a relation, and maybe we could generalize it to where it's like a sort of top level thing that's like relation arrow with relation or something along those lines that has those properties if it turns out to be more general than TLDraw. But we also would want to enable arrows that don't have relations. Like it's not a required property for arrows. And so this is kind of where we're getting to the point where we want nodes to be defined by a schema. And the schema is something that individual canvases can choose to extend the schema with additional properties. And that gets to the final thing that you were talking about, Max, where nodes can also have properties about them that we need to store and make sure that we don't collide and stomp on properties. Make sure that you maintain them even if you can't read them. This is the property bag piece. So I don't think I've said anything new, or that we've said anything new that we haven't said in past meetings, but I think it's a helpful kind of summary. So I'm glad you brought it up, Max. Obviously the devil's in the details here. So there's probably some detailed questions that pop out of this, but does this summary kind of bring us all back on the same page or get us all on the same page, more or less?
The question about relations, sure. Relations can also be used for groups, sets.
Yes, that's right. That wasn't a question, that was a statement. Or maybe that was a question, and I missed it, the inflection. A statement, okay. Happy to answer it as a question, though. Yeah, in the current, I think, actually, this might be in the PR. Yeah, it looks like it is. In the current PR, there is a mention of, I think, 3 different kinds of relations. Let's see. Yeah, core relations are sets, which are groups, edges, and hyperedges are basically the 3 different types that we've identified so far.
I'm thinking of something of ways to break it. And one that occurs to me is a door. Doors are kind of like an arrow, but they relate to one thing. Like I had software and I had to make a room, and people wanted to drag a door onto the wall. So this door is associated with that wall, but it's not an arrow between 2 objects. It's just associated with one thing at one particular location. And would I use a relation for that?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
You can use a hyper edge that has one endpoint.
Yeah.
Or a set.
So it does fit within there.
It has just
Yep.
one from or one
Yeah,
two
if it just
depends.
right, if it just had one room that it went to, then that's basically a from to relationship is my understanding. It's like relationship between door and there'd be several ways to model it, and
Yeah.
it would be up to you, but you would be able to model it as a relation, an edge effectively between your door node and your room node.
Yeah, just a normal
Yeah.
edge, right?
Right.
Just yeah.
Cool.
Yep. Yeah, this is something that the sets edge and hyper edges is something I'm so curious if we come up with other things that are needed. And for that reason, we decided that node relations, or not decided, we proposed that relations would also be represented by schemas. So if you came up with another type of relation, then you could define that relation in this using the same schema syntax that we're hoping to use for nodes. We saw no reason to like restrict sets in that way that they would not be, but it's hard to think of another kind of relation other than sets, edges, and hyper edges. Orion and I sat and talked about this for a long time and looked at different examples, both in the 3D space, Aaron, and in like all the existing canvases that we're aware of. So I think those capture a lot. Yeah.
There's still one edge case about hyper edges. So if you have a hyper edge that has some incoming nodes, some outgoing nodes, and some undirected nodes, then you cannot specify this undirectedness on the level of the hyper edge itself. You need to state it on the endpoints. So from and to is not enough. You need some kind of undirected attached to as well in order to model that. That's just
I'll take your word for it. Hyper edges were an entirely new concept to me when Orion explained them. So I always push all those questions to Orion as our resident hyper edge expert and lover. So yeah, you were probably correct. I cannot say.
Now I do have a question now. Actually, can a resource contain a canvas itself?
Of course. Conceptually, of course, if we can serve canvases over the web, then they are a resource, so they can be included, which is actually cool.
Also embedded in line.
Yeah, logically.
Yeah, they could. That's wild.
I think that's a really good point to bring up, and I will say that that's something that many people in the GLTF ecosystem have noted is being missing, is that like a GLTF can't refer to another GLTF, and it'd be nice if like Open Canvas came with like that ability by default.
Yeah. And there are several different examples of existing infinite canvas that are effectively support embedding canvases where you can zoom into a canvas deeper, zoom into another canvas deeper, zoom out. Muse, the desktop app, supports this, but several others as well.
Yeah, in my own tool that I'm building, I have compositions, and you can place multiple compositions on the same canvas, but they are the same composition under the hood. I think it could be handled with the resources.
I see what you're saying. That's another great example of transclusion. Very cool. Yeah, so there was a question here in terms of the status of the draft and was pointing at what I was just showing, which is this. This is the draft that is in the initial draft branch on the spec.
Well, it should point to to my repository, which is a fork of this with the JSON schema.
Oh, wonderful. Michael, you and I should work to bring that into this one then. Yeah. And so did you fork off of this branch?
Yeah, but I now have, I think, rights to this repository, so I probably can make a branch directly. I will do that.
Open a PR and like I'd love to review it and give you feedback, and then we can bring that in. So the great point. This does not represent the only work that's been done on the spec. Michael has a branch off of this that has some adds in the JSON schema stuff. The JSON schema stuff is definitely missing from this, but I guess one question would be, when we initially started working on the spec itself, we assumed that the pull request would be a place where discussion could happen, kind of long running discussion until we brought it in. And I noticed that Aaron has left some comments on it as well. Is it still like, it feels like we're at this like alpha point for the spec where merging it back to main and appropriately adding a like disclaimer at the top of the spec of like, spec is not done. This is not a 1.0. But you can, and then doing more of a smaller in PRs against the current document, because it's gotten quite large since we've been working on it, versus like this long running PR where we're continuing to make comments and stuff. It feels like shifting to that workflow feels like it's a good time for that. Does anyone else agree or disagree? Should we just keep this PR open for a few more weeks or months while we work on the spec, and use a single PR?
Yeah, I think we should look at the discussion we just had, the long discussion about if the current spec still matches this. I think it does for a lot of things, but resources aren't yet in the spec, so
yep,
I've got
the
something
resources
already in
stuff
the
in the
JSON
spec.
schema, but very, very limited.
Yeah, no, the resources stuff is not as well spelled out in the spec. It's mostly been discussions that have happened over the last several meetings, and particularly Max doing some digging and bringing stuff to light. So I need to make it match.
In my
okay, I think
opinion, it's perfectly fine to like merge what you got so far, and iterate on it from there with more changes, as long as you're following the golden rule of Git, which is to go from one working state to another working state. So you don't want to merge the PR if it's like, not consistent with itself. So like if maybe like the schema describes some property and that property isn't like in the prose of the README, like that is obviously nonsense and can't be implemented.
great point. Yeah. And I definitely follow that rule for software. This is my very first time actually working on a spec. Like I've worked with specs, but never worked on one. And so this has been really fun to think about how the process aligns with my software workflow. That's great. Yeah, we can definitely do that. At this point, the spec is small enough that it's pretty much all in my head still. Like I can hold that entire document in my head, which is really nice, in terms of like, I hope it doesn't get too much more complicated, but I can take the work, especially now with Michael stepping up and helping with more of the logistics. That means that after this meeting, I can let him handle turning this meeting into a discussion in GitHub with all the associated materials, and I can go work on making sure the spec lines up and merging that back. So I'll take that as an action item between now and the next meeting, is getting the Michael reviewing your stuff on JSON schema, and then also making sure that it matches what we just discussed and merging it in. One other bit of news is Orion is moving a mere hour-and-a-half plane ride from my house. And so there's a possibility that Orion and I get together and do like a in-person work session for a couple of days, because I feel like we could make a lot of progress, especially building a working implementation that actually implements the spec. All right. I think we have two other items. Oh shoot, it's already 12:56. I have not had a clock in front of me because I'm not in my office. We have Aaron, do you want to discuss transforms real quick? And then we've got about 5 minutes till the end of the meeting. I could stay a few minutes after as well.
Yeah, so just briefly, one of the most fundamental things I think about any kind of format that describes a scene, whether that be a 3D scene or a canvas, is the positioning and rotation and scale, just the transforms of objects. And this seems like to be aside from the name of the object, probably the single most important like fundamental property. Um, and I think like if it were me designing the base spec, I would have everything related to transforms in the base spec, not in an extension. Um,
Mhm.
and I see here that there's like rotation that's specified in an extension. So um, to me,
Mhm.
I would think rotation is a pretty common thing. It's going to be defined by many people if it's not in the base spec. So I would probably just put it in the base spec. And
Mhm.
aside from rotation, there's other considerations with a canvas-based format like size, maybe anchors or offsets, or I don't know exactly what is in scope for Open Canvas, but these are all like anything transform related that is deemed to be like common and universal, I think should be in the base spec.
No, that's a good point, and it's something that we Orion and I debated about back and forth, and looked at sort of the yeah looked at existing canvases to see what they supported. Um, X and Y as separate vectors are stored as arrays, meaning that you should have a position array with X and Y in it.
Yeah,
Um,
at least that's how it's done in GLTF.
yeah, yeah, I could see that either way. I think a couple of the big um, one of the things I think one of the considerations we were making was again around brevity, or making it, if it's possible, like yeah, just making it shorter to specify one of these nodes and not having a ton of required properties at the top level. Um, and so that was the reason for X, Y, and even leaving out rotation. Some canvases literally don't support rotation. And so that was another reason for making it part of the an extension, or on a node by node basis should be the way to say it. Um,
Well, there's a
but yeah, I
distinction
could go either way.
uh, between being an extension and being a required property.
Yeah,
So what Aaron says, we should make it standard so that we don't have different definitions of rotation in different extensions.
that does
That's
have
why
that
he wants to
advantage.
put it in the
Yeah.
main namespace, but it doesn't have to be a required property. We can still get the same brevity and leave out rotation for all items that have no rotation defined and fine.
Yeah, you would define a
Ah,
default
I gotcha.
rotation of 0. So if it's not rotated, then
Of
you don't specify rotation.
course.
And
Yeah.
if you're importing into an app that doesn't have rotation, you would have to discard it. And that is going to be inevitable. Unless you have control over every client app that uses OpenCanvas, you're going to have different implementations that have different feature sets. So there will be some loss converting, and
Yes.
that's just inevitable. You're just gonna have to accept it.
Yeah. I'd actually say I would go so far as to say it's actually desirable. Of like, there's uh like some of these canvases are designed to be simpler, and that is the selling point. And so you would actually, loss is actually a desired feature for moving to a simpler canvas, because it, for the end user of that canvas, they have less to think about, less features, and they're able to kind of focus. So,
Absolutely. And I think from the user's expectation as well, they really don't expect to, import a canvas with rotation and then get rotated items, even though their own app doesn't support that. That'd be weird if like imported files could do more than the app.
right.
Yeah. So as long
Yeah, that,
as
yeah.
the feature set of the format is enough that it allows like both sides of the equation to do their best, so to speak. So, if you export a thing from that has rotation and you import it into an app that doesn't have rotation, it won't have the rotation. Import to an app that does have the rotation and it will have the rotation. So like you don't want the format to be an artificial bottleneck.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think all this makes sense. The one, Max, as I'm going back to write up, I know we're at time right now, and so I'm going to wrap up here. But while I have you on the call, I'm going to go write up the spec. And the one thing I don't have loaded in my brain is, did we come up with a solution for how to handle multiple extensions on a single node that have the same property name?
Well, there are several possible ways. So I think we had like one property bag per extension. That was
That's
the
right.
first idea. And
Yep.
then each property bag, or no, it's an extension array. And then in each extension object, we have like what's actually the spec version of this extension, and then the actual properties nested again. And then in GLTF, they made it much simpler and more elegant and just say, okay, we move it all in the same property bag, but we make the distinction in the property names. So they use prefixes on the property names so that they are actually different properties. And then JSON link data turns that even further and says, yeah, actually the prefixes should be mapped to full URIs. So you have the usual namespacing rules from the web and or like in XML, and have it even more clear. And actually even in GLTF, I found a link that GLTF can embed XMP metadata and stores that in JSON LD. So JSON LD is already part of GLTF in one extension. And maybe we should just go all in with JSON link data.
The question I have is for what?
To have just one agreed upon extension mechanism for JSON and not reinvent the wheel.
Okay, but JSON is already itself a data format that's general.
But not an extensible one. If you
Why
merge
is
two
JSON not extensible?
If you merge two JSON objects describing the same properties with the same names, but you mean different properties, they overwrite each other. So you cannot say my rotation as defined for the scene graph of my Unity 1.1 file and my rotation as defined for and both with the same name rotation. So the next step in order to avoid the name ambiguity is to say mine is some prefix rotation and yours is some other prefix rotation. But then these prefixes are again, in some unhappy cases, the same prefix. So we need longer prefixes. And in order to be really, really, really sure, we arrive at almost the same as XML namespaces. And the modern way of doing that concept in JSON seems to be JSON LD, or at least a good look into JSON LD to not reinvent the wheel.
Thank you for that explanation. I think you're actually the first person that's explained to me like why JSON LD is useful. So the way that GLTF avoids the name conflicts though is that the vendor prefixes are reserved in a global registry so that only that vendor is allowed to use that prefix, and then every property that uses that prefix is in extensions slash vendor prefix underscore whatever the extension is, and slash and then the properties, so it's all like namespaced properly so they don't conflict with each other. But yeah, that makes sense.
You have this registry of prefixes and there's some organization that ensures the prefixes are unique. And if you have that, that's maybe even a better solution because
it's effectively the same thing as what you already have with the schemas referring to at OCWG, like in the schema name.
Yeah, that's just in JSON LD that they sort of generalize that concept and embed a mapping from namespace prefix to namespace extension into the file if you want. And then you have it completely fully decentralized, generalized. Nice. I think I'll have to look into that a bit more, maybe we just need to add a little like context object into right at the top level and then can use prefixes again. I think we need to use prefix colon blah blah and then it might be JSON LD conform. But I'm not familiar with JSON LD at this point. I just found out this is if there's a thing, this is the thing.
Got it. Well, I will in the version of the spec I'm working on right now, I'll probably just note that there is a possibility of conflicts and there are several discussions about how to handle potential conflicts. And I may try to find a link to the GLTF docs that says, here's one potential approach here, that kind of stuff. But just note that we are aware that the way it's currently written, extensions can conflict.
On the right of the canvas, I put an example of how I currently implemented it myself in the export to OCWG draft.
Okay.
Gotcha. Scroll to the the right side.
Okay, well, I'm noting that we're like now well more than 5 minutes over. This has been a great discussion. Thanks for jumping back in. We will try to do another meeting in 2 weeks, and Michael will help get that on the calendar, and I will try to make sure that I do my homework between now and then. And Max, if you do any digging into Jason LD and feel like dropping in an issue, that's great. But I won't. It don't feel like you're not blocking me on anything. So. All right, y'all. Thanks for being here. We'll talk again soon. Thank you, Aaron. Much appreciated.
I'll try to come to every meeting if I can, just to give my take on everything.
Oh,
Yes,
so great.
thanks, Aaron.
Thank you. Okay. Bye, y'all.
Bye bye.